Chapter 1. The fire keeps going out. Hey guys. Tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to a time when winter wasn't just a season. It was a full-time job. So, get cozy. Maybe grab a blanket, preferably not one infested with medieval fleas, and settle in. Because tonight we're talking about how people in the Middle Ages tried to survive the coldest winters, while living in wooden huts that could barely keep a candle lit. Picture it. The year is somewhere around 1300. You're in Europe, doesn't really matter where, because everywhere is equally damp, cold, and vaguely smelling of cabbage. Snow is falling outside, the wind is howling like it's personally offended by your existence, and your roof? It's leaking. But that's life in a wooden hut. Now, hut might sound a bit insulting, but honestly, it's the most accurate description. Most peasants lived in single-room homes, built by themselves or their neighbors, from whatever wood was available nearby. These weren't the charming log cabins we like to romanticize. Think less rustic retreat, more damp box with aspirations. The walls were usually made of wooden posts stuffed with a delightful mixture of mud, straw, and occasionally manure, because of course they used manure. It sealed cracks and insulated. Barely. In summer, it baked and hardened. In winter, it crumbled and froze. A medieval version of home maintenance meant re-smearing cow dung on your living room wall every few months. Lovely. Inside, things were simple. There was a hearth in the center, usually just a pit dug into the dirt floor, where a small fire would burn day and night. Or at least, it was supposed to. If that fire went out in January, congratulations, you just entered the hope you don't die tonight phase of the year. There was no chimney in most huts. Smoke from the fire drifted upward and hopefully found its way out through a hole in the roof or between the boards. Usually it didn't. The entire interior would fill with smoke, giving everything, your hair, your clothes, your lungs, a permanent campfire aesthetic. People's eyes constantly watered, and it wasn't because they were emotionally moved by the beauty of winter. And yet, despite the discomfort, this smoky setup did have one strange benefit. The smoke actually preserved the wooden beams and deterred pests. So, yes, everyone was mildly choking 24/7, but at least the roof wasn't eaten by beetles. A fair trade, apparently. Now, let's talk heating. The fire was everything. Cooked food, dried clothes, kept babies alive, and generally decided whether you woke up the next morning as a human or a medieval popsicle. So, families guarded it like a member of the household. Before bed, they'd bank the embers under ashes to keep them glowing overnight. If it still had a spark in the morning, it was a small victory. If it went out, you'd have to trudge through snow to borrow fire from a neighbor. There was no instant light. You couldn't strike a match. Matches wouldn't exist for centuries. To start a new fire, you'd need flint and steel and a bit of luck. Or patience. Or both. Sometimes it took so long that it was easier to walk a mile just to borrow someone else's flame. Yes, literally walking to a neighbor's house carrying a burning stick. And if it went out on the way back? Congratulations, you've just invented the medieval cardio routine. Now, if you're wondering how these huts stayed even remotely warm, they didn't. Not really. The average interior temperature in winter hovered just above freezing. The walls leaked air. The roof dripped. The floor was mud. You could feel the wind coming through the gaps. And yet, this was home. So, how did they sleep? Well, everyone shared one bed, or rather, one straw mattress laid directly on the floor. Privacy wasn't a concept. Families huddled together under layers of coarse blankets, animal skins, or whatever fabric they owned. Sometimes they even brought in animals overnight. Yes, literally cows and goats, because animals gave off heat. You might complain about your partner hogging the blanket, but imagine trying to sleep with a goat breathing in your ear. And hygiene? That was minimal. People didn't bathe in winter unless they wanted pneumonia as a hobby. Water was freezing, and heating it took too much firewood. So you just dealt with it. Dirt was practically an accessory. You wore it proudly like, yes, this mud? Very vintage. Got it last autumn. Speaking of firewood, that was another headache. Peasants needed enormous amounts just to survive the winter. But cutting trees was expensive, physically exhausting, and sometimes illegal. Forests often belonged to local lords, and taking wood without permission could get you fined, or worse. So, people gathered fallen branches, roots, or even dried animal dung. That's right, burning cow chips wasn't just a joke. It was the only affordable fuel option. Let's float over to food for a moment. Imagine being cold all day, your breath fogging indoors, and your dinner options are bread that's gone hard, some weak pottage soup, and maybe, if you're lucky, a bit of salt pork. Diets were repetitive, heavy on carbs, and light on excitement. But you couldn't afford to be picky when the alternative was starving. They preserved food however they could, salting, drying, or burying things in the ground. Pickling was common too, mostly vegetables. Because when you don't have a fridge, the dirt outside is your fridge. Drinks? Everyone had ale. Not the strong, pub kind. Medieval ale was weak, low alcohol, and brewed mainly because water was unsafe. People drank it like water. Even children. Morning ale, lunch ale, bedtime ale. It was basically the medieval version of hydration. Now, remember, all this was happening while Europe was going through what historians call the Little Ice Age. Starting around the 14th century, winters got longer, colder, and generally more miserable. Rivers froze solid. Crops failed. And nobody had central heating. Imagine that your only defense against the cold is one smoky fire, some goats, and optimism. And yet, life went on. People got married, had children, gossiped about their neighbors, complained about taxes. Because yes, even in freezing huts, the tax collector still showed up. There's something comforting in that consistency. Inside those huts, daily life revolved around the fire. The entire family gathered there, cooking, talking, repairing tools, and occasionally praying for spring. The walls were dark from soot, the floor sticky with mud, and the air thick with smoke. But in that glow of flickering light, people told stories, sang songs, and pretended for a few minutes that they weren't slowly freezing. Sometimes, travelers or monks passing through villages would write about what they saw. And almost all of them commented on how smoky and cramped these huts were. A 12th century writer once complained that peasants live like beasts, with their animals in filth. Which, while rude, was also sort of accurate. But that was the point, it was survival, not style. And the nobles? Oh, they had it better, sure, but not by much. Their castles were giant, drafty stone refrigerators. But we'll get to them later. For now, the peasants remain our stars, resilient, tired, occasionally smoky people doing their best to not die before spring. Let's take a moment to appreciate the small comforts they did have. A warm loaf of bread fresh from the hearth. The sound of the wind outside while you huddle close with your family. A rare sunny morning after weeks of gray. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Of course, sometimes roofs collapsed under snow, or floods came in spring, or disease swept through. But the human tendency to endure is impressive. Even when the fire keeps going out, they'd relight it again and again because that's all they could do. And so, another winter would pass. The smoke-stained beams would hold. The mud walls would dry and crack. The chickens would complain in the corner. And life, somehow, continued. Because in the Middle Ages, comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Warmth was temporary. Cold was constant. But routine, that was everything. Let's float, now, to the next chapter, where the peasants' smoky huts seem almost luxurious compared to what came next. The stone chambers of the medieval nobility, who discovered that castle life wasn't nearly as glamorous as it sounds. Chapter 2. The nobles in their frozen castles. Let's drift upward now, from the smoky huts of the peasants to the towering, drafty fortresses of the people who supposedly had it all. You'd think that if anyone was warm and comfortable during the medieval winter, it would be the nobility. You know, the ones who owned half the land, collected all the taxes, and wore fur-lined everything. But here's the thing, they weren't. Not even close. Castles looked magnificent from the outside, great stone walls, tall towers, flags flapping proudly in the icy wind. Inside, though, they were colder than a saint's tomb. Imagine living inside a refrigerator built for defense, not comfort. Because that's exactly what a castle was, a military structure with delusions of being a home. Stone keeps held heat about as well as a bucket holds smoke. The walls were several feet thick, and while that was excellent for keeping out invaders, it was equally good at keeping in the cold. Fires roared in enormous hearths, but the warmth barely reached beyond a few feet. Step too far away, and you were instantly back in permafrost territory. And yet, people lived there, slept, ate, plotted, and occasionally froze together in elegant misery. Let's begin with the Great Hall. That was the social heart of a castle, where everyone gathered to eat, talk politics, and generally pretend they weren't all slowly turning into icicles. A massive fire would burn in the center or along one wall, and the higher your social rank, the closer you sat to it. Because of course warmth was hierarchical. The lord and lady sat nearest the blaze, while servants and guards huddled further away, probably wondering whether frostbite counted as a workplace injury. The ceilings were high, which looked impressive but meant that most of the heat floated away into the rafters. Smoke lingered below, curling through tapestries and settling in your lungs. So yes, even the wealthy were coughing their way through dinner. But at least they had wine to soothe their throats, and an audience to admire their suffering. Bedrooms were hardly better. If you think having a private room in a medieval castle meant luxury, think again. Most chambers were small, cold, and only slightly less drafty than the open courtyard. Windows, if they existed, were just holes covered with cloth, parchment, or, if you were truly fancy, a thin pane of glass. That's right, one pane. Single glazing. The kind that might as well not exist in January. At night, the temperature inside could drop close to freezing. So people piled on layers, wool blankets, fur throws, and sometimes literal straw stuffed under the sheets for insulation. They also wore clothing to bed, shirts, caps, even gloves. Forget silk nightgowns. Medieval pajamas were basically your day clothes, slightly less muddy. And yet, despite the discomfort, the nobility loved to perform the illusion of comfort. Bedrooms were decorated with bright fabrics, carved furniture, and those famous canopy beds, not just for drama, but for warmth. The canopy trapped a pocket of heat and kept drafts from dripping down from the stone ceiling. Curtains around the bed weren't for privacy, they were a thermal survival system. Servants usually slept in hallways, kitchens, or directly on the floor near the hearth. They were expected to keep fires burning, haul wood, and make sure their lord didn't wake up encased in frost. So yes, luxury required a small army of exhausted, freezing attendants. Now, let's talk about bathing. You might imagine noble ladies lounging in steaming tubs while servants poured hot water over them. And sometimes, yes, that happened on special occasions. But daily bathing? Most nobles avoided it in winter because heating enough water was ridiculous. Fires were for cooking and staying alive, not for your skincare routine. Instead, people relied on dry washing, basically wiping themselves with linen cloths or rinsing select body parts with a bowl of tepid water. Perfumes, scented oils, and herbs helped disguise the general medieval musk. So if you entered a castle and thought, wow, it smells like smoke, dogs, and human ambition, you'd be correct. Let's move to another charming winter problem: plumbing. There wasn't any. Well, not really. Castles had garderobes, small rooms with holes and benches that emptied down into cesspits or moats. So when the moat froze in winter, it became less of a defensive barrier and more of a frozen sewage sculpture. Delightful. And yet people just lived with it. They wrapped themselves in fur-lined cloaks, sipped warm wine spiced with cloves, and convinced themselves they were doing fine. The medieval nobility were experts at denial. Meals in winter were feasts of necessity. Game meat, salted fish, and preserved fruit. Fresh vegetables were rare, unless you counted onions that had survived in the cellar. Everything came with sauce, not for flavor, but to mask the taste of been sitting in storage since autumn. Drinking was essential: wine, ale, mead, anything to feel warm for 5 minutes. They even heated wine with spices, creating early versions of mulled wine. It wasn't about celebration, it was about survival with flair. And through it all, the castle's inhabitants performed courtly rituals as if nothing was wrong. There were dances, games, storytelling, and poetry. Musicians played in corners, trying to keep their fingers from freezing to their instruments. Life went on, but slower. Winter was a season for endurance and performance, pretending you were thriving when you were really just shivering gracefully. Now, you might wonder, what about all that fur clothing? Didn't that keep them warm? Sort of. Nobles wore layers upon layers: linen undershirts, wool tunics, cloaks, and furs. But even the best clothes can't beat the chill of an unheated stone fortress. The rich looked fabulous, but they still had blue lips. Children were especially vulnerable. Many noble infants didn't survive their first winters. Midwives and servants did everything they could, keeping fires lit, wrapping babies in layers of linen and fur, but cold crept in through every crack. It's a grim reminder that no amount of gold or heraldry could change the basic physics of a medieval January. Let's not forget the servants. They were the unsung heroes of castle winters. They hauled endless buckets of water, chopped wood in snow, and scrubbed icy floors with freezing hands. They lived in cramped quarters, often without fires of their own. Yet they kept the household functioning. The nobility depended entirely on them, though they rarely noticed it, unless, of course, the wine ran out. Even kings weren't spared. Take Henry II of England, for example. He built magnificent palaces, but chroniclers still complain that his halls were smoky and cold. Or Edward I, who traveled with entire caravans of bedding, tapestries, and carpets just to make his temporary lodgings slightly bearable. You could carry luxury with you, but warmth remained elusive. And so, castles in winter were paradoxes, symbols of power that couldn't conquer the weather. They stood tall, imposing, and utterly miserable. When snow blanketed the countryside, roads vanished, and travel stopped. Nobles were effectively trapped in their stone shells, surrounded by courtiers, servants, and too much time. It was a season of gossip, boredom, and simmering feuds. You couldn't just leave when someone annoyed you. You had to sit there by the same fire, day after day, pretending you didn't want to shove your cousin into the moat. And yet, there was beauty in it too. The hush of snowfall over battlements. The glow of torches flickering in narrow halls. The sound of a minstrel's song echoing through cold chambers. Medieval winters were brutal, yes, but they were also strangely serene. So, while the peasants huddled in smoky huts and the nobles shivered behind stone walls, both groups shared the same reality: winter didn't care who you were. It leveled everyone equally. And that's a strangely comforting thought, isn't it? Now, let's drift onward, to the monasteries, where monks faced the cold with discipline, prayer, and an alarming lack of central heating. Chapter 3. Monks, Frost, and Holy Endurance. Let's float quietly now, away from the clanking halls of the nobility and into somewhere even colder, but somehow calmer. The monastery. If the peasants survived through grit and the nobles endured through denial, the monks handled winter through discipline and divine resignation. And perhaps a little bit of numbness, both spiritual and physical. Monasteries dotted the medieval landscape like small islands of order in a very chaotic world. From the 10th century onward, they were everywhere. Stone complexes surrounded by fields, gardens, and maybe a few sheep who probably regretted their life choices every winter. Inside lived men, or women in convents, who had traded the noise of the world for a life of prayer, routine, and drafty cloisters. Now, monasteries were built with stone, because apparently everyone in the Middle Ages decided insulation was overrated. The walls were thick, the floors cold, and the air eternally damp. But that was fine, because comfort was not the point. Monks weren't supposed to enjoy life. They were supposed to endure it gracefully, ideally while copying a manuscript with frost-bitten fingers. The typical day in a monastery followed a strict rhythm. 7 prayer services, starting before dawn, continuing throughout the day, and ending after dark. The first bell, matins, could ring at 2 or 3 in the morning. Yes, in the middle of winter, when the world was still black and the cold so sharp it made your teeth ache. The monks would rise silently, shuffle through freezing corridors in thin robes, and gather in the church. No fires, no warmth, just candlelight flickering over their breath in the air. And then they'd chant. Slowly, methodically, sometimes for hours. The sound must have been haunting, deep voices echoing off the stone, mixing with the wind outside. It was meant to bring them closer to God, though I imagine it also brought them closer to hypothermia. After prayers came work. Depending on the order, that might mean tending animals, making wine, brewing ale, or copying texts. Monks were surprisingly practical people. They were cold, yes, but they were also efficient. If they needed candles, they made them. If they needed ale, they brewed it. And if they needed money, they sold what they made to the locals, because holiness still needed a business plan. Inside the scriptorium, the writing room, the cold was legendary. Imagine sitting at a wooden desk, quill in hand, trying to copy the Bible by hand while your ink freezes in the pot. Chroniclers actually complained about this. One wrote, "The fingers write unwillingly for the cold, and the ink grows thick." Another monk doodled in the margin of his manuscript, "Oh, the cold is so great." It's basically the medieval version of "I hate Mondays." Monks wore wool robes called habits, usually with hoods. Underneath, linen shirts, and sometimes, if their order allowed, woolen socks. But even with layers, the chill sank in. The stone floors radiated cold up through their sandals, and the wind found every crack. Some monasteries eventually installed braziers or small fireplaces, but often only in the kitchens or infirmary. Heating the whole place? Unthinkable. The Lord might have been their shepherd, but he was not paying the fuel bill. And yet, these were some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe. Unlike peasants or nobles, monks bathed regularly, once a week, sometimes even twice. It was part of their discipline. They washed clothes, kept their dormitories tidy, and practiced rudimentary hygiene. Of course, that meant heating water, which meant a lot of wood, which meant more work. But at least they smelled better than everyone else. Meals were plain and predictable. Bread, vegetables, legumes, maybe fish on special days. Meat was banned in many orders, though fish sometimes included convenient loopholes like beavers or barnacle geese. Because nothing says holy restraint like calling a semi-aquatic rodent a fish. Meals were eaten in silence, in long stone refectories. A monk would read aloud from scripture while the others chewed quietly, shivering in their robes. Talking was forbidden, so communication happened through gestures, an early form of monastic charades. You could spend 20 minutes miming "pass the salt" and still not get any. Night brought no relief. The dormitories were communal, unheated, and echoing. Rows of simple beds or straw mattresses, each monk lying under a wool blanket, probably thinking about the warmth of eternal paradise. Sleep came in fragments, broken by bells calling them to prayer. But over time, their bodies adjusted to the rhythm, the cold, and the endless quiet. Despite all this, monasteries were not miserable places. Strange as it sounds, they were often centers of innovation. The monks kept records of weather, agriculture, and medicine. They experimented with herbs, invented better brewing methods, and even designed heating systems, very small ones, for their workrooms. They were cold but not stupid. And in winter, when the world outside was bleak and frozen, monasteries glowed faintly with candlelight and calm. Travelers would sometimes seek shelter there, grateful for a bowl of warm pottage and a roof that didn't leak. To them, the monastery was a haven. To the monks inside, it was a place to test patience and faith. Some abbeys were built in isolated, dramatic landscapes, like the cliffs of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, where winter storms crashed below, or the high valleys of the Alps, where snow piled against the gates. The monks there must have felt like they were living halfway between earth and heaven, cold in both directions. Of course, the line between devotion and discomfort sometimes blurred. There are stories of monks breaking the ice on rivers to bathe, or fasting through entire winters. Some did it to prove their holiness. Others probably just didn't have much food left. Either way, it kept their priorities very clear. The irony is that while monasteries looked peaceful, they were often busy, noisy places during the day, workshops humming, bells ringing, visitors coming and going. Winter only slowed things slightly. The gardens slept under frost, but the monks still had manuscripts to finish, tools to repair, prayers to chant. And always, fires to tend, small ones, carefully rationed, because even monks couldn't escape the laws of fuel economy. One of the most fascinating things is how monasteries adapted architecture to survive the seasons. Cloisters, the covered walkways, were designed to shelter monks from wind and rain as they moved between buildings. The thick walls retained some heat from the sun, and the enclosed courtyard sometimes trapped a faint, fragile warmth. It wasn't much, but in January, a little warmth went a long way. Let's drift into a typical winter evening there. The last prayers have ended. The candles flicker. The corridors echo with the faint shuffle of sandals. Somewhere, a bell tolls softly through the fog. In the dormitory, monks lie still, hands folded on their chests, as frost forms quietly on the inside of the window. Outside, the wind sighs through the cloister arches, and in the kitchen, the last embers glow like tiny red eyes in the dark. It's peaceful. Cold, yes, but peaceful. And in that peace, something remarkable survived. The rhythm of time, the keeping of knowledge, the fragile thread of civilization. While peasants struggled in their huts and nobles brooded in their castles, monks preserved books, wrote chronicles, and copied texts that would outlast them all. They froze their fingers, but they kept history alive. So, in a strange way, the cold helped. It slowed the world down. It made people still long enough to write, think, and remember. Winter was a season of endurance, but also of memory. Let's wander, now, from the silence of the monasteries to something noisier and slightly more chaotic, the medieval town, where markets steamed, streets froze, and people somehow managed to make a living amid the frost and filth. Chapter 4. Town Frost, Markets, Mud, and Midnight Ale. Now, let's drift away from the quiet discipline of monasteries and float gently into the slightly less serene, slightly more chaotic world of medieval towns. If castles were cold, silent fortresses, and huts were smoky endurance boxes, towns were somewhere in between. A jumble of narrow streets, rickety timber buildings, and frozen, mud-choked alleys. Medieval towns were busy, even in winter. Merchants and craftsmen plodded through snow and ice to tend to their shops, hawk their wares, or deliver messages across slippery streets. Unlike the countryside, where isolation kept people contained, towns were full of bodies, animals, and the smell of everything. Mud, manure, smoke, and the faint scent of desperation. Combine that with frost, and the air had a bite that made every breath a reminder that winter was relentless. The buildings themselves were often built from timber, with overhanging upper stories that leaned into the streets. The streets were narrow, muddy, and crowded with carts, people, and animals. In winter, the mud froze into a slippery gray crust. Trips to the market could easily become accidental slapstick, as merchants slipped over frozen puddles or tripped on hidden ruts. And yet, everyone had to keep moving. Trade didn't pause for frostbite. The market square was the heart of town life. In winter, vendors tried to stay warm by setting fires in iron braziers, though smoke drifted lazily over the crowd, mingling with the scent of roasting chestnuts and pickled herring. People jostled for space near the warmth, their breath fogging the air as they bargained for necessities. You could see fur-lined cloaks, woolen hoods, and straw-stuffed shoes, each person layered against the cold. Fashion was secondary to survival. Food in town was scarce in winter, especially fresh vegetables. Apples stored in barrels, dried beans, salted meat, and pickled cabbage made up most diets. Bakers worked tirelessly to keep bread coming, their ovens glowing like tiny suns in the bitter darkness. The smell of baking bread must have been a rare delight, a tiny, warm triumph against the general gloom. And yes, ale was everywhere. Taverns were the social centers of the town, even in the dead of winter. People would gather around flickering hearths, sipping weak ale, swapping gossip, and generally trying not to notice the frozen air seeping through cracks in the walls. It wasn't just a drink, it was survival and a small pleasure in a harsh world. Children drank ale too, weak enough to avoid immediate intoxication, but enough to warm their small bodies in the absence of better options. Street animals contributed to the chaos. Dogs, cats, pigs, and chickens wandered freely, sometimes frozen, sometimes rummaging for scraps. The smell was overpowering, a combination of manure, rotting vegetation, and the occasional bit of spilled ale. People tolerated it because it was part of life. In winter, there was nowhere for animals to graze, and humans had nowhere warm to run. Survival meant coexisting with mud and fur in close quarters. Housing in towns was cramped. A single family might occupy one room above their shop or one small timber house. Floors were often packed earth or rough planks. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through cracks in the walls, mingling with frost creeping through gaps in the roof. Townspeople slept huddled together under straw mattresses, animal skins, and any rags they could spare. Warmth was temporary, stolen from the fire, and gone as soon as someone moved too far from it. The wealthy merchants fared slightly better. Some had stone-built houses with fireplaces that could retain heat for hours. But even they suffered through icy drafts, frozen pipes, or rather, buckets of water that had become blocks of ice, and layers of fur for sleeping. Winter was democratic in its misery. No one was untouched. Daily life in the streets was hazardous. Snow and ice made transport slow and treacherous. Mud and filth were unavoidable, clogging shoes and boots. Frozen rivers cut off access to some areas, and bridges became dangerous with ice patches. Town guards patrolled, not just for crime, but to ensure people didn't injure themselves falling on the streets, a surprisingly common winter occurrence. But life went on. Craftsmakers continued to work. Blacksmiths hammered metal in cold, smoky shops. Weavers tended their looms. Carpenters cut wood to repair doors, shutters, and roofs. Everyone had a role, and everyone endured. The medieval town was an ecosystem of survival, with every citizen participating in the slow, relentless struggle against cold and scarcity. Let's drift to entertainment, or what passed for it. In winter, townspeople had limited options: storytelling, singing, or attending the occasional festival if one survived the frost. Indoor games like dice or chess were popular, but mostly, people simply huddled in warmth, sharing news and gossip. Misery was social, and humor, though muted, was vital. Sarcasm and irony thrived quietly in these cramped, icy spaces. Health was precarious. Cold, damp conditions encouraged illness, which could spread quickly in tightly packed homes and alleys. Frostbite, respiratory infections, and general exhaustion were constant threats. Hospitals existed in some larger towns, usually run by religious institutions, but winter demand often overwhelmed them. Survival required endurance, luck, and sometimes a good sense of resignation. Children played where they could, usually outdoors. Snow offered rare amusement, though it was brief before cold made play impossible. Indoor games were limited to storytelling, singing, or rough improvisations with whatever toys could be made from scraps. These moments were brief, fragile respites from the general harshness of medieval town life. And let's not forget the smells. Fresh snow didn't hide the filth for long. As soon as ice melted in midwinter, the streets turned to slush and reeked of waste, animal droppings, and stale food. But townspeople adapted. They navigated it, ignored it, or at least tolerated it with grim humor. Life demanded pragmatism. Markets shut only when rivers froze completely, preventing transport of goods, or when snow piled so high that streets were impassable. Otherwise, trade continued, fueled by necessity and a stubborn refusal to be idle. Traders risked frostbite to deliver bread, ale, and firewood. Their lives were harsh, but they kept the town alive. As night fell, streets emptied gradually. Fires in homes glowed faintly behind frosted windows. Tavern lights flickered, smoke curling lazily into the cold air. Townsfolk retired to their cramped rooms, huddled under whatever blankets and skins they owned. Outside, the wind howled, the frozen mud cracked under weight, and the distant bell of a church tolled. Life in a medieval town never truly stopped, even in the deepest freeze. And yet, there was rhythm and continuity. Families, neighbors, and even the occasional traveler survived through routine, shared struggle, and small comforts. A warm loaf of bread, a fire that burned a little longer than usual, or a mug of spiced ale. The cold was omnipresent, but so was human ingenuity and endurance. Winter in a medieval town was not glamorous. It was damp, freezing, and relentless. But people adapted. They layered clothing, shared warmth, cooked over smoky fires, and found small joys in each other's company. Life continued quietly, patiently, until spring finally returned to thaw the streets, soften the mud, and breathe warmth back into every timbered home. And now, let's drift gently to the next story, the journey of medieval women during winter, whose lives were a delicate balance of labor, endurance, and a constant struggle to stay warm in the shadow of frost, smoke, and responsibility. Chapter 5. Women, Work, and Winter Woes. Now, let's drift gently into the lives of medieval women during winter. If peasants were enduring smoky huts, nobles were shivering in stone castles, monks were freezing in silent cloisters, then women were doing all of that, and more. Because they didn't just survive, they sustained the household, kept the fire alive, and somehow managed to remain, at least outwardly, presentable. Winter was the busiest time for women in the medieval world. Fields were dormant, yes, but domestic work never stopped. Cooking, cleaning, laundering, caring for children, and tending to animals all had to continue despite frost, mud, and smoke. And while men might be repairing fences, chopping wood, or negotiating with the Lord, women were the ones orchestrating daily survival. Let's start with the hearth. It was women's domain. The fire needed constant attention, stoking embers, adding wood or dung, and making sure the smoke didn't choke the family entirely. Cooking was mostly over open flames or rudimentary ovens, both temperamental in freezing conditions. A dropped pot, a sudden gust through a cracked wall, or a misjudged ember could ruin a meal, or worse, start a fire in a wooden hut. Meals were repetitive but necessary. Pottage, a thick, bland soup made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, was the staple. Women had to stretch food as far as possible, sometimes using clever tricks like adding water, herbs, or small bits of leftover bread to feed a hungry family. There was no takeout if supplies ran low. Survival required ingenuity, patience, and an iron stomach. Laundry in winter was miserable. Rivers and wells froze, and boiling water had to be heated over the fire, a slow, exhausting process. Clothes dried very slowly in cold, damp air. Women often layered clothing over damp linen, which created a personal sauna effect, except without comfort or privacy. And yet, hygiene mattered. Families couldn't afford lice, sickness, or the social disapproval that came from looking unkempt. Childcare added another layer of complexity. Children were vulnerable to the cold, disease, and malnutrition. Women swaddled infants in layers of linen and wool, sometimes adding straw or fur for insulation. Babies might sleep with parents or near the hearth for warmth, though the smoke often made the room uncomfortable. Yet women remained vigilant, watching over the little ones, nursing the sick, and soothing cries through bitterly cold nights. Beyond the home, women contributed economically. They spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, and made candles, often selling surplus goods at the market. Their work was vital, especially in towns where families depended on multiple income streams to survive the harsh winter. Sometimes, their efforts sustained the household entirely while men were away or incapacitated by illness or injury. Noble women faced a different but equally challenging winter. Castles were cold, damp, and drafty, and heating even the lordly chambers was insufficient. Noble ladies managed the household staff, oversaw food stores, and tended to domestic logistics, all while dressing in heavy layers of linen, wool, and fur. Their duties were largely invisible but essential. They were responsible for ensuring that the castle ran smoothly, that fires burned, and that guests, if there were any, did not freeze. Fashion in winter was practical as much as it was status-driven. Long gowns, cloaks, hoods, and fur trims were layered to trap heat. Gloves, stockings, and fur-lined boots protected hands and feet from frostbite. Yet the visual impression mattered. Appearances still conveyed power and prestige, even if they came at the cost of comfort. Heavy clothing restricted movement, making daily tasks more cumbersome, but warmth and social standing were both critical. In towns and villages, women also faced the challenges of commuting to markets, fetching water, or gathering firewood. These tasks required navigating icy streets, trudging through snow, and carrying heavy loads. Any fall or injury could be disastrous, particularly in the middle of winter when medical help was scarce and mobility was limited. Yet they persisted, largely unnoticed, keeping the rhythm of life ticking while the cold gnawed at fingers and toes. Social life in winter for women was limited but not non-existent. They gathered at wells, markets, or communal spaces, exchanging news, gossip, and practical advice about surviving frost, illness, and scarcity. These networks were essential. Knowledge about which alehouses were warmest, which neighbors had extra flour, or which herbs could stave off winter illnesses saved lives. Winter made social connections both practical and comforting. Let's not forget the emotional labor. Women maintained morale. They soothed children frightened by storms, comforted spouses frustrated by cold and hunger, and kept the household spirits from completely collapsing under the relentless pressure of frost. Humor, patience, and quiet resilience were tools as essential as firewood or food stores. Even for women of faith, winter brought challenges. Convents were cold and drafty. Religious obligations demanded early rising, long hours of prayer, and labor-intensive tasks, all in freezing conditions. Layers of wool and fur were necessary, but insufficient. Bathing was sporadic, often rationed, and water had to be heated over the fire, which meant extra labor. Yet, discipline, community, and devotion helped women endure. Illness was an ever-present threat. Frostbite, respiratory infections, and influenza could spread quickly among children, servants, and family members. Women were typically responsible for care, from administering herbal remedies to maintaining warmth and feeding the sick. Their success or failure could mean life or death, making winter both physically and emotionally exhausting. And yet, women found small joys. A warm loaf of bread fresh from the oven, the glow of the hearth in the evening, or a moment of quiet storytelling with children provided fleeting comfort. In towns, they could observe festive events, brief gatherings, or local markets, offering a temporary respite from routine. These small pleasures were essential for survival in the long, dark months. Overall, medieval winter life for women was a delicate balance of labor, endurance, and resourcefulness. They were essential to the survival of families, communities, and even the economy. Without them, homes would freeze, children would starve, and towns would falter. Yet, much of their work went unnoticed, uncelebrated, and quietly endured. In a way, women embodied winter itself, persistent, unyielding, and often underestimated. They carried warmth where there was none, nurtured life in impossible conditions, and kept the rhythms of medieval society alive. While men and nobles faced the cold more visibly, women confronted it everywhere. Inside and outside, day and night, in work and in care. And so, as the frost thickened outside, fires glowed faintly in huts, castles, and homes alike. Women tended the flames, children huddled under layers of wool and straw, and the medieval world continued to turn slowly under the relentless grip of winter. Next, we'll drift into a slightly lighter chapter, exploring the peculiar ways medieval people tried to improve warmth, heating innovations, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes effective, and always labor-intensive. Chapter 6: Medieval Heating Hacks, Smoke, Stones, and Sheep. Now, let's drift gently into the inventive, if occasionally questionable, world of medieval heating. Because surviving winter wasn't just about endurance, it was about finding ways to keep warm with whatever the universe and your local lord happened to provide. And in true medieval style, that often meant improvisation, resourcefulness, and sometimes a complete disregard for common sense. Peasants, as we've seen, had their smoky huts and central hearths. But firewood was expensive, scarce, or otherwise encumbered by the lord's permissions. So people improvised. Animal dung was a common fuel, cow, horse, or even human in rare circumstances. Not exactly aromatic, but it burned slowly and gave off surprising heat. Imagine huddling close to that, sniffing a combination of smoke, hay, and regret. Necessity was creative. Another common method was the use of heated stones. Stones could be placed in the fire until they glowed red, then wrapped in cloth and carried or positioned under straw mattresses. The warmth lasted only a few hours, but it was enough to stave off frostbite. Medieval parents relied heavily on this method to keep children warm at night. One imagines small hands pressing against stones with a mixture of relief and suspicion, as if the glowing rocks might bite back. Let's talk about bed sharing. Not just for family closeness, though certainly that was part of it. Sleeping together meant conserving body heat. Entire families, sometimes including animals, crowded into a single straw-stuffed mattress. Dogs, cats, and occasionally pigs were brought indoors specifically to contribute warmth. The smell must have been overwhelming, but survival trumped olfactory discomfort. It's worth noting that, historically, the medieval mind did not equate hygiene with survival in quite the way we do today. Clothing innovations were critical. People layered whatever they could: linen undergarments, woolen tunics, cloaks, hoods, fur trims, straw-insulated boots. Wealthy individuals added silk or velvet, partly for warmth and partly for status. Accessories like gloves, caps, and socks became essential in winter. Nobles might wear fur-lined hoods so large that they could double as sleeping bags. Not very aerodynamic, but highly functional. Let's drift to fireplaces in castles and larger homes. These were monumental structures, often decorated with carvings, mantels, and tapestries. But despite their size, they were inefficient. Heat dissipated quickly through high ceilings, poorly insulated walls, and drafty windows. Ingenious solutions included placing iron screens in front of the fire to direct warmth, or hanging tapestries along walls to trap heat. Again, function and fashion intertwined. Medieval interior design was basically a long experiment in ductless heating. Chimneys were a relative innovation. Earlier medieval homes often lacked them entirely, relying on holes in the roof or simply letting smoke escape wherever it could. Smoke-filled rooms were the norm, with all the coughing and soot staining that came with it. The chimney improved air quality slightly, but the smoke often still lingered, and the fire remained labor-intensive. Someone, usually a servant or a particularly unlucky peasant, had to keep the embers alive. Candles and lamps contributed modestly. Tallow candles, oil lamps, and rushlights provided small amounts of heat and light. They were far from efficient, but they offered psychological comfort. Watching a candle flicker could make a room feel slightly less freezing, even if your toes disagreed violently. In monasteries, heating hacks were subtle. Small braziers were used in scriptoriums and infirmaries. Monks sometimes kept warming stones in beds or under robes. Cloisters and workspaces were oriented to maximize sunlight, though winter daylight was short. Monks layered clothing and sometimes wore gloves while writing manuscripts. Some orders even encouraged light exercise indoors to stimulate warmth, a mix of practical physiology and enforced labor. The nobility often took comfort seriously, or at least attempted to. Rich carpets, tapestries, and curtains were hung not just for decoration, but for insulation. Bed canopies trapped pockets of heat. Hot baths, when available, were considered luxuries but could stave off frostbite temporarily. Wealthy women employed servants specifically to carry heated stones or hot water bottles to their chambers. That's right, hot water bottles, medieval style. Essentially, ceramic or metal vessels filled with hot water, carried carefully under furs. Hazardous, but effective. Let's not forget that animals were considered heating devices. Beyond the obvious bed companions, livestock might be brought into barns attached to homes or stables connected to living areas. Their body heat contributed to warmth, though it also added to smells, fleas, and general discomfort. The medieval approach to comfort was pragmatic, but not delicate. Even streets had their own heating hacks, in a way. Snow-covered roads were sometimes trodden down to create compact pathways. Markets and taverns were placed strategically near wood sources or sun-exposed walls. Townsfolk might huddle in alcoves, doorways, or near ovens to steal a few precious degrees of warmth while conducting trade. Clothing adaptations extended into ingenuity beyond mere layers. Some people stuffed garments with straw, feathers, or wool scraps. Gloves were extended to cover forearms. Hoods were pulled low to minimize heat loss from the head, which accounts for a large proportion of body heat. Shoes were stuffed with moss, wool, or old fabric. Comfort was improvised, elegance was aspirational. Even royal heating hacks were sometimes strange. Chroniclers note that some monarchs placed braziers directly under the table during meals to warm legs. Others employed servants to fan embers toward their chairs or to throw hot embers onto footstools. Medieval innovations sometimes resembled a combination of brilliance and mild lunacy. In towns, tavern owners exploited the desire for warmth commercially. Fires, hearths, and small stoves drew patrons who might linger, drinking ale or wine to generate body heat. Taverns became a winter survival mechanism disguised as social life. Think of them as early communal central heating, only with slightly more odor and significantly more noise. Finally, let's drift to the psychological aspect. Knowing that warmth could be stolen, rationed, or temporary created an ever-present vigilance. People constantly monitored fires, clothing, animals, and food. They planned ahead for cold nights, stockpiled fuel, and layered both clothing and bedding. The medieval approach to winter was as much about mental endurance as physical warmth. So, while medieval winters were cold, relentless, and often brutal, people developed a range of hacks to survive. From dung fires to heated stones, layered clothing, and animal companions, ingenuity met necessity at every turn. Comfort was fleeting, warmth was hard-won, and survival depended on constant attention to the details that modern humans often take for granted. And with that, we can drift next into one of the most harrowing aspects of winter survival, the journey of medieval travelers, merchants, and pilgrims who faced not only the cold but ice, snow, and the occasional medieval highwayman. Chapter 7: Travelers in Frost, Roads, Inns, and Frozen Misery. Now, let's drift quietly from the warmth of homes, huts, and castles into the far less comfortable world of medieval travelers in winter. Unlike peasants who stayed put, nobles with drafty castles, or monks with cloisters, travelers were exposed to the full force of the season. Theirs was a life of constant negotiation with frost, snow, ice, and the occasional human hazard. Roads were rarely paved. In winter, they were mud-choked rivers frozen into slick ruts, or icy tracks that refused to hold a horse's hoof. Deep snow made passage slow and exhausting, particularly in hilly or forested regions. Travelers wore layers, of course, wool, furs, leather, but there were limits. Even the most determined pilgrim or merchant could only tolerate so many hours of exposure before extremities went numb. Horse travel helped, but it was far from perfect. Horses struggled in snowdrifts, and thin winter fodder made long journeys precarious. Many travelers resorted to sledges or carried goods themselves. Roads were dangerous for multiple reasons. Ice made slips common. Hidden ditches could trap both horse and rider. Wolves sometimes followed travelers, drawn by the scent of horses or livestock. And humans, when desperate or malicious, presented equal danger. Highwaymen thrived in winter, preying on slowed caravans and isolated pilgrims. Inns and hostels were the primary hope for warmth, but they were inconsistent at best. Many inns were little more than timbered hovels with a fire in the center. Travelers shared the smoke-filled room with other humans, animals, and possibly the occasional rodent. Privacy was non-existent, warmth was scarce, and the risk of disease was high. Inns charged by the night, but the value often depended entirely on how close you could get to the fire. Meals along the way were similar: pottage, salted meat, hard bread, or leftover stew. Ale or weak wine was often the only liquid available, both for warmth and hydration. Travelers ate quickly, huddled near embers, and moved on before frost claimed the inn entirely. Sometimes, travelers brought their own food, which had to be preserved for weeks in the bitter cold. Let's consider pilgrims for a moment. Pilgrimages were immensely popular in medieval Europe, often undertaken in the dead of winter. Religious devotion, or perhaps stubbornness, drove them to endure frostbitten fingers, numb toes, and swollen, wet boots. They carried heavy packs, walked miles across snow-choked fields, and slept in barns, churches, or under trees when no shelter was available. Pilgrims often huddled in groups for warmth, sharing bodies, blankets, and the occasional prayer. Merchants had their own set of challenges. Moving goods from town to town required careful planning. Frozen rivers, icy roads, and sudden snowstorms could ruin supplies or delay delivery. Some merchants even hired guides to navigate treacherous winter paths. Animals were vulnerable, wagons were prone to skidding, and humans had to endure hours in sub-zero conditions to maintain commerce. Even nobles who traveled for political or personal reasons weren't immune. Their horses might be well-fed and their carriages padded, but stone castles were left behind and inns were often inhospitable. Courtiers wrapped in furs, huddled over braziers in temporary lodgings, still complained about the cold. Chroniclers frequently mentioned frostbitten fingers, sore backs from travel, and the general misery of leaving home in winter. Roadside hazards were numerous. Falling icicles, frozen rivers, hidden ditches, and treacherous bridges were constant threats. Travelers had to be vigilant, both physically and mentally, constantly aware of what could go wrong. This awareness was exhausting, particularly after hours of trudging through snow or icy slush. Fatigue lowered resistance to cold, making exposure even more dangerous. Animals were both companions and liabilities. Dogs and pack animals could help carry supplies or provide warmth, but they also slowed travel, slipped on ice, or ate precious provisions. Travelers often rationed food and fuel carefully, knowing that any miscalculation could be fatal in a blizzard. The social aspect of travel was also significant. Strangers huddled together in inns, shared fires, or exchanged advice about routes and hazards. News traveled with pilgrims, merchants, and itinerants, creating a network of winter survival knowledge. Travelers relied on each other, often more than any official guidance, because roads weren't patrolled and weather forecasts were non-existent. One striking detail: travelers often slept fully clothed, sometimes in damp boots, under layers of blankets or straw. Fires might be small or non-existent, and warmth was stolen, not guaranteed. Frostbite was common, colds were inevitable, and influenza could spread rapidly along travel routes. Yet, people continued to move, driven by commerce, devotion, or necessity. For the unlucky, winter travel could be fatal. Snowstorms could bury travelers in hours. Wolves or thieves could strike with little warning. Illness struck faster when resources were scarce and movement was exhausting. Yet chronicles of the time also show resilience, stories of arriving safely, of clever use of inns, fires, and shared body warmth, and of pilgrims reaching their destinations despite extreme hardship. And there was a strange beauty too. Frozen rivers reflected pale sunlight. Snow-covered fields stretched silently, muffling sound. Frosted forests created ethereal landscapes, while moonlight glinted off icy roads. Despite the misery, medieval travelers occasionally experienced moments of quiet wonder. Travelers in winter were the connective tissue of medieval life. They carried goods, news, and ideas. They kept commerce alive, pilgrimages ongoing, and towns supplied. Their struggle against frost and snow was daily, exhausting, and often dangerous. Yet it was essential. Without them, towns would starve, castles would go isolated, and monasteries would see far fewer visitors. In essence, winter travel was a crucible of endurance, ingenuity, and human persistence. Fires, furs, heated stones, and small inns allowed survival. Community, vigilance, and improvisation ensured it. Medieval travelers learned, slowly and painfully, that warmth was never guaranteed, but survival often depended on their determination to keep moving, step by icy step. And now, let's drift from the hardships of travelers to the quiet persistence of winter in the countryside, the rhythms of agricultural life, survival strategies, and the strange, patient endurance of rural medieval families. Chapter 8: Country Frost, Fields, Families, and Endless Winter Work. Now, let's drift gently back to the countryside, where medieval families faced winter not in crowded towns or drafty castles, but across vast, frozen fields and in humble, smoke-filled huts. Life here was slow, laborious, and dictated entirely by the season. Survival wasn't glamorous. It was a constant negotiation with frost, wind, and scarcity. Fields lay dormant under snow or frost, and most crops had already been harvested and stored. Grain, root vegetables, and preserved foods would sustain the family, but only just. There was no supermarket, no delivery, no magic. Storage cellars, often dug into the ground, were cold and damp, but they kept root vegetables, grains, and salted meat usable through the long months. Moisture, however, was the enemy. Rot could destroy supplies overnight, leaving families rationing even more carefully. Animals required constant care, even in deep winter. Cows needed milking, pigs needed feeding, and chickens needed shelter. Livestock also provided warmth and comfort. Barns were often attached to homes or positioned close to the living quarters. The heat radiated faintly, a small mercy in an otherwise bitterly cold landscape. Women, men, and children all participated in this endless labor. Survival was a family project, and there was no one to delegate the work to. Water was another challenge. Wells often froze, rivers slowed or iced over, and people had to expend extra effort to gather liquid for drinking, cooking, and washing. Water fetching became an exercise in endurance, carrying heavy buckets across frozen ground, sometimes slipping on ice or breaking through thin layers of snow-covered ice. It was exhausting, repetitive, and unavoidable. Hearths remained the heart of the home. Smoke curled lazily through roofs or chimneys, infusing the hut with warmth, odor, and soot. Cooking and heating were simultaneous struggles. Every fire demanded constant attention. One misjudgment, and the flame might die, leaving the family shivering, or a stray ember might ignite the hut itself. Fires were the lifeblood of winter survival, and tending them was everyone's responsibility. Clothing was layered and utilitarian. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, cloaks, and fur-lined boots kept people functional if not particularly comfortable. Hats and hoods were essential, as most body heat escaped from the head. Hands and feet, the most exposed parts, were often wrapped in rags, straw, or extra wool. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents went to extraordinary lengths to keep them warm. Swaddling, layering, and communal sleeping were all strategies to protect the young from frostbite and hypothermia. Daily chores didn't pause for cold. Firewood had to be chopped, water drawn, food prepared, and livestock fed. The rhythm of work governed every day. Even small tasks were multiplied by necessity. One fire might require multiple hearths, one meal might need multiple stoves, and every job had to be done under layers of clothing, gloves, and sometimes numb fingers. The cold slowed everything but did not stop it. Winter also meant isolation. Roads were impassable, neighbors were distant, and travel was risky. Families depended on their own skills, resourcefulness, and stored supplies. Ingenuity became survival, preserving food, improvising insulation, and making repairs before cold worsened conditions. There was little room for error. A failed strategy could mean frostbite, hunger, or illness. Illness was particularly dangerous. Cold, damp, and malnourished bodies were vulnerable to respiratory infections, fevers, and other winter ailments. Families relied on simple remedies, herbs, broths, and warmth, because access to physicians was limited, particularly in remote villages. Survival required resilience and patience, as help was slow or non-existent. Despite hardships, winter allowed for reflection and community rituals. Families told stories by the fire, sang, or quietly observed the passage of time. Seasonal holidays provided brief relief, a feast here, a religious celebration there. These moments, though rare, broke the monotony and offered psychological warmth in addition to physical strategies. Children's lives were shaped entirely by the season. Play was limited, but imagination flourished. Snow offered opportunities for games, though brief, while indoor activities included weaving, spinning, and small tasks to assist the household. Education, when available, occurred mostly at home, often interwoven with labor. Winter imposed both hardship and structure on young lives. Let's consider tools and housing. Huts were small and constructed primarily from timber, wattle, and daub, insulated with straw or mud. Roofs were thatched, providing some protection against snow, though leaks were common. Floors were packed earth or straw. Insulation was minimal, meaning that body heat was a primary source of warmth, especially when combined with fires, shared beds, and clothing. Families developed clever strategies to cope. Heated stones in beds, animal companions, multiple layers of blankets, and small fires in strategic locations were all part of winter life. Ingenuity compensated for the lack of luxury. Survival demanded constant attention to both environment and resources. Agricultural work was reduced but never absent. Repairing fences, maintaining tools, preparing for spring planting, all had to be done when weather allowed. Fields couldn't be left entirely unattended. Snow and ice slowed progress but didn't pause it. Work was dictated by practicality, daylight, and the ongoing struggle against frost. Psychologically, winter imposed patience and endurance. The monotony, cold, and labor were unrelenting. Yet families found routines, small pleasures, and shared resilience. Life became a rhythm: wake, tend fire, care for animals, prepare meals, maintain shelter, sleep, repeat. It was simple, harsh, and utterly necessary. In a sense, the countryside embodied medieval winter at its purest, raw, relentless, and immersive. Every breath, every movement, every task was a negotiation with frost. Every small success, fire maintained, animals fed, family clothed, was an accomplishment. Survival was incremental, repetitive, and profoundly human. So, as night fell over frozen fields, smoke curled from chimneys, animals huddled in barns, and families huddled in huts. The frost thickened outside, but inside, life endured. Cold, labor, and scarcity shaped the medieval year, teaching patience, ingenuity, and quiet resilience. Next, we'll drift toward the seasonal celebrations that punctuated these harsh winters, the holidays, rituals, and communal moments that offered warmth, camaraderie, and brief reprieves from the relentless cold. Chapter 9: Medieval Winter Festivals, Fire, Feast, and Flickering Lights. Now, let's drift gently into something warmer, if only temporarily, the winter festivals of medieval Europe. After months of cold, darkness, and relentless labor, these celebrations offered fleeting moments of light, warmth, and human connection. They were not extravagant in the modern sense, but they carried profound significance for communities, families, and individuals alike. The calendar dictated most of these festivals. Religious observances such as Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas were central, but secular traditions, Yule, midwinter celebrations, and local fairs also provided structure and ritual. Each festival involved elements of fire, food, music, and communal gathering, creating pockets of warmth in the otherwise frozen season. Fire played a critical role. Large bonfires, hearth fires, and torches illuminated the dark winter nights, warded off cold, and symbolized life enduring through the harsh months. In rural villages, a Yule log might be ceremonially carried into the home and burned over several days, its heat shared between family, animals, and sometimes neighbors. The log itself often became a storytelling device, carved with symbols, blessed by clergy, or saved from year to year. Food was central to celebration. Winter provisions were rationed carefully, so feasts were rare and eagerly anticipated. Pottage, bread, salted meat, preserved fruits, and cheese were common staples, while the wealthy might enjoy more elaborate fare: roasted meats, pies, spiced wine, and rich cakes. Communal meals reinforced social bonds and provided nourishment not just for the body, but for morale. Even a simple shared meal could transform a frigid evening into one of warmth and cheer. Music and storytelling punctuated these gatherings. Minstrels, bards, and local performers offered songs, tales of heroes, and humor that alleviated the monotony of winter. Families gathered around fires to sing carols, recite legends, or share personal stories. Humor, even subtle or sarcastic, was a form of survival, easing the psychological burden of cold and scarcity. Lighting was both practical and symbolic. Candles, rushlights, and torches provided illumination, but also represented the endurance of hope. Churches were decorated, windows might be covered with thin cloth to retain warmth, and small flickering flames created a sense of intimacy in otherwise dark spaces. Light was cherished because it was rare, and its presence temporarily transformed the environment. Religious rituals often merged with secular customs. Blessings were offered over food, livestock, and hearths. Charitable acts, like distributing food or coins to the poor, reinforced community cohesion. Pilgrimages, prayers, and small ceremonies reminded people of divine presence and protection through harsh winters. Festivals were a mix of celebration, endurance, and practical preparation for the coming months. Children's participation was significant. They helped prepare decorations, assisted in cooking, and performed small tasks during communal celebrations. Play and amusement were integrated with work, teaching responsibility while offering brief enjoyment. For young people, festivals represented a temporary reprieve from the daily struggle of survival. In towns, market fairs often coincided with these festivals. Traders brought in seasonal goods, spices, dried fruits, preserved meats, and small luxuries. Townsfolk could acquire items they might otherwise lack during the winter months. Inns and taverns were livelier than usual, hosting visitors, merchants, and locals. Heat, light, and food converged to create temporary oases of comfort. Even the nobility participated, though in grander and more controlled forms. Castle halls were decorated with greenery, tapestries, and candles. Feasts were abundant, fires burned continuously, and entertainment was staged. Music, dancing, and storytelling provided not just amusement, but a demonstration of status and power. Yet the cold could not be entirely banished. Even in stone halls, drafts persisted, and servants labored constantly to maintain warmth. Winter festivals also carried symbolic meaning. They represented the cyclical nature of the seasons, hope for renewal, and human resilience. Fire, feasting, and fellowship were physical and emotional antidotes to months of hardship. Participants embraced warmth, light, and social bonds, understanding that the cold would inevitably return, but that the community could endure it together. The preparation for festivals was extensive. Families cleaned homes, gathered firewood, preserved extra food, and repaired clothing. These tasks were labor-intensive, especially in winter, but the anticipation of celebration motivated people. Work and festivity were intertwined, creating a rhythm that structured the season. In some regions, games and competitions complemented festivals. Skating, sledding, or mock battles on snow were popular, particularly in areas where conditions allowed. These activities offered amusement and minor exercise, stimulating warmth and morale. Even small competitions, races, wrestling, or board games, broke the monotony of frozen months. Gift-giving existed in limited forms. Homemade goods, preserved foods, or small tokens were exchanged among family and friends. Luxury items were reserved for the wealthy, but the act of sharing reinforced social ties and conveyed goodwill. Festivals became opportunities to reaffirm relationships, offer thanks, and maintain community cohesion through acts of generosity. After the celebrations, people returned to routine, tending fires, caring for animals, and enduring the cold. Yet, the warmth, food, and companionship lingered as psychological comfort. Even brief, the festival's effects carried through daily life, making survival a little more bearable. In essence, medieval winter festivals were vital for both survival and spirit. They combined practical preparation with symbolic ritual, communal warmth with personal enjoyment, and light with months of darkness. They reminded people that, despite frost, scarcity, and labor, life endured, and warmth, physical and emotional, could be shared. As the festival fires dimmed, the snow fell quietly outside, and families, neighbors, and travelers returned to their daily tasks. Winter remained relentless, but the human spirit had been fortified, even if only temporarily, by fire, feast, and flickering lights. Next, we'll drift into the quieter, reflective side of winter life, how medieval people found solace in reading, prayer, and introspection during the coldest months, when the world outside was frozen and movement was limited. Chapter 10. Solitude and Reflection, Books, Prayer, and Quiet in Winter. Now, let's drift gently into the quieter side of medieval winter life, where frost, darkness, and cold created conditions for contemplation, introspection, and slow, deliberate activity. Not every moment was labor or survival. Some were reserved for thought, prayer, or the occasional book, if one was fortunate enough to possess one. Monks and nuns, naturally, were the most documented practitioners of winter reflection. Cloisters offered a rhythm of prayer, study, and work, although the cold made even these disciplined spaces challenging. Stone walls retained frost, and small windows let in the chill. Fires, when present, were small and smoky, but they allowed just enough warmth to read manuscripts, copy texts, or write letters. Books themselves were rare and precious. Illuminated manuscripts, religious texts, and practical handbooks were handled carefully, often with gloved hands to avoid oils from skin staining delicate pages. Winter, with its long nights and limited agricultural or outdoor labor, provided opportunity to study these texts. Monks might read, transcribe, or illuminate manuscripts for hours, the faint flicker of candlelight casting shadows on stone walls. Prayer filled much of the quiet winter hours. Monastic schedules mandated multiple sessions daily, but the cold intensified the focus. Kneeling on stone floors, bundled in woolen garments, participants endured frost and draft in service of devotion. This physical discomfort was part of the experience, a reminder of humility, endurance, and spiritual vigilance. In noble households, reflection took subtler forms. Wealthy individuals had private chambers where fires, tapestries, and furniture created microclimates of comfort. Winter offered time to read religious or philosophical texts, compose letters, plan estates, or meditate quietly. Women and men alike could retreat from communal areas to contemplate, observe the snowy landscape, or simply enjoy a temporary respite from incessant labor. For peasants and rural families, quiet reflection often occurred in tandem with routine. While stoking fires, tending small animals, or mending clothing, people might pray, tell stories, or think through plans for spring. The rhythm of labor itself encouraged introspection. Winter's slow pace, limited daylight, and repetitive tasks created space for thought, creativity, and problem-solving. Silence was both practical and contemplative. In the countryside, snow muffled sound, creating a hushed environment. Frosted fields, frozen rivers, and barren trees provided a backdrop for reflection. Travelers who paused on icy roads experienced similar stillness, quiet punctuated only by wind, footsteps, or animal movement. These moments, though harsh, allowed mental space, fostering patience, resilience, and a subtle connection with nature. Firelight and candlelight played a symbolic and practical role in reflection. The flickering of flames mirrored the impermanence of warmth and life, while casting shadows that encouraged contemplation. Monks, nobles, and peasants alike watched flames curl and dance, finding comfort in their rhythm. These small rituals, a careful tending of the fire, the turning of a page, the muttering of a prayer, were all ways of imposing order on the otherwise relentless winter. Winter reflection often included storytelling. Families, communities, and even travelers shared tales, some humorous, some cautionary, some religious. Oral tradition thrived during long nights. Storytelling preserved culture, offered moral lessons, and provided companionship. Children learned patience, adults learned caution, and everyone found distraction from cold and hardship. Contemplation also had a practical aspect. Planning for the next season, evaluating food stores, or devising strategies for livestock, fuel, and clothing were all cognitive forms of survival. Reflection was rarely purely abstract. It was tied directly to life and survival. People thought, planned, and anticipated, often quietly, as they performed necessary labor. Isolation, too, became a teacher. Winter imposed constraints on movement, making solitude more common. Whether in rural huts, monastic cells, or private chambers, people were left with themselves and their thoughts. For some, this fostered creativity, patience, and problem-solving. For others, it was simply endurance. In either case, solitude was inseparable from winter experience. Religious devotion remained central. Prayer was often structured but could also be spontaneous. People prayed for warmth, health, survival, and protection of loved ones. They also prayed for guidance and reflection on moral or spiritual matters. Long nights encouraged meditation, moral evaluation, and quiet contemplation, creating an inner world to offset the harshness outside. Books, where available, offered both education and solace. Manuscripts on religion, medicine, or philosophy were treasured. Monks copied texts carefully, ensuring knowledge survived winter and year after year. In noble houses, a book might be read aloud by a servant or perused individually. Even brief encounters with literature offered mental warmth, imagination, and a sense of continuity. Winter reflection also had a social dimension. Small gatherings, shared prayers, or communal reading fostered connection. Even brief exchanges reinforced human bonds and provided psychological comfort. Life in winter, though cold and constrained, was not entirely solitary. Reflection and shared ritual created both inner and outer warmth. Ultimately, winter in the medieval world demanded both physical endurance and mental adaptation. Reflection, prayer, and reading were essential tools, allowing individuals to endure months of darkness, frost, and labor. They were ways to impose order, find comfort, and cultivate patience in a season that tested every human faculty. As snow drifted silently outside, fires crackled faintly, and lamps flickered in drafty windows. People paused in their work, knelt in prayer, or turned the fragile pages of manuscripts. Winter was relentless, but the human mind and spirit found ways to endure, adapt, and survive. Next, we'll drift toward the intersection of winter and illness, the way cold, damp conditions influenced health, disease, and mortality, shaping life and death in the medieval months. Chapter 11: Winter Illnesses, Cold, Damp, and Contagion. Now, let's drift quietly into the darker, but still slow and contemplative, side of medieval winter, the intersection of cold, damp, and disease. Winter was not just about frostbitten toes or frozen rivers. It also shaped human health, creating conditions where illness spread easily and mortality increased. The season imposed challenges that were physical, psychological, and social, often in subtle, persistent ways. The most obvious factor was cold itself. Prolonged exposure to low temperatures weakened the body, lowered immunity, and made ordinary ailments more dangerous. Frostbite and hypothermia were real threats, particularly for travelers, peasants, and even the poorer nobility who lacked adequate heating. Extremities, fingers, toes, ears, noses, were especially vulnerable, often turning red, then purple, then black if ignored. Families improvised. Layers of clothing, heated stones, bed sharing, and animal warmth were all strategies to stave off permanent damage. Dampness compounded the problem. Huts, castles, and even monasteries were poorly insulated. Snow and rain seeped through thatched roofs, stone walls, and timber frameworks. Floors were earthen, sometimes layered with straw, but moisture crept in anyway. Wet clothing or bedding became a vector for colds, rheumatism, and more persistent illnesses. Even the simplest daily task, fetching water or tending animals, could leave people chilled and vulnerable. Respiratory diseases were particularly prevalent. Coughs, colds, pneumonia, and influenza-like symptoms swept through villages and towns. Smoke-filled homes from constantly tended fires ironically exacerbated these conditions, irritating lungs and making breathing difficult. Heating was essential, but it was imperfect and often came at the cost of indoor air quality. People lived in a constant compromise between warmth and smoke inhalation. Nutrition played a subtle but critical role. Winter food stores were limited, and monotonous diets of preserved grains, salted meat, and root vegetables left people lacking in certain nutrients. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making even minor illnesses more serious. Children and the elderly were especially susceptible. For many, winter mortality peaked not during storms or frosts, but quietly over weeks of cumulative weakness and vulnerability. In towns, dense populations amplified risk. Tradespeople, artisans, and merchants often worked in close quarters. Illness spread quickly through shared living spaces, markets, and inns. Travel increased the potential for contagion. Pilgrims, merchants, and wandering workers carried diseases from one settlement to another, often unintentionally. Winter's limited sunlight also affected vitamin D intake, further compromising health. Medical understanding was rudimentary. Treatments included herbal remedies, poultices, bloodletting, or prayers. Physicians, if available, relied on humoral theory, balancing cold, wet, dry, and hot properties of the body and environment. Remedies often made little difference, and many were as likely to harm as to help. Survival depended more on resilience, hygiene, and small practical measures than on medical expertise. Children faced unique risks. Frostbite, respiratory illnesses, malnutrition, and exposure combined to make winter particularly deadly for the youngest. Families swaddled infants, layered clothing, and shared heat, but these measures could only do so much. Records indicate that child mortality often spiked in winter, quietly reshaping households and communities. Elderly people, too, were vulnerable. Reduced mobility, chronic illness, and frailty meant that even modest cold could be dangerous. Tasks that required leaving the hearth, fetching firewood, tending animals, or walking to markets, were both necessary and hazardous. Communities often relied on informal support networks to care for older members, though these were not always sufficient. Mental health was affected as well. Darkness, isolation, and relentless cold could create melancholy or fatigue. While medieval people may not have conceptualized depression as we do, chronic discomfort, uncertainty about survival, and the cumulative weight of daily labor surely affected morale. Winter demanded patience, endurance, and psychological resilience alongside physical survival. Epidemics sometimes struck in winter, exacerbated by poor sanitation, crowded living conditions, and weakened bodies. Smallpox, measles, and dysentery were threats in both towns and rural areas. Quarantines were rudimentary, often based on superstition or practicality rather than medical knowledge. Survival was as much a matter of luck as skill or preparation. Animals, too, carried risks. Livestock could harbor fleas, lice, or other parasites, some of which transmitted disease. Close contact in barns or shared living spaces increased the likelihood of transmission. People had to balance warmth and practicality against the hidden hazards of proximity to animals. Even the wealthy were not immune. Castles and manors, despite better insulation, could not entirely escape cold, damp, or illness. Noble families relied on servants for warmth, care, and food preparation, but human error or exposure could still lead to sickness. The luxury of stone walls and tapestries mitigated risk, but did not eliminate it entirely. In some, winter amplified vulnerability. Cold, damp, poor nutrition, isolation, smoke, and limited medical understanding created a season of subtle but persistent danger. People survived through ingenuity, endurance, social networks, and sheer stubbornness. Illness was rarely dramatic. It crept in quietly, weakening bodies over days or weeks, reminding everyone that survival was both a daily labor and a matter of luck. The human response was multifaceted: warmth through fire and clothing, careful food rationing, communal support, and practical hygiene. Psychological adaptation, storytelling, prayer, reflection helped sustain morale. Even in the darkest, coldest months, people found ways to endure, adapt, and maintain routines that preserved life. As snow piled on rooftops and frost glazed riverbanks, medieval people faced winter with a quiet resilience. Fires burned dimly, breath fogged in cold rooms, and illness simmered beneath the surface. Yet, they endured, step by step, day by day, through frost, damp, and disease, relying on ingenuity, patience, and communal bonds. Next, we'll drift into the world of winter commerce and trade, the strategies medieval towns employed to survive and prosper when frost dominated both roads and markets. Chapter 12: Winter Trade and Town Life, Markets, Merchants, and Frosted Streets. Now, let's drift gently into the rhythms of town life during medieval winter, where frost, ice, and snow reshaped daily routines, commerce, and human interaction. Towns were hubs of survival, trade, and occasional comfort, but winter imposed unique challenges that required adaptation, patience, and ingenuity. Streets were slippery and often impassable. Snowdrifts, ice, and mud combined to slow travel and complicate transport of goods. Wooden wheels, leather shoes, and animal hooves all struggled to maintain traction. Townspeople quickly learned which routes were passable, which shortcuts were treacherous, and which inns provided temporary refuge from the cold. Survival required both physical endurance and local knowledge. Markets operated differently in winter. Open-air stalls were bitterly cold, and vendors bundled themselves in layers of wool, furs, and straw-insulated boots. Food and merchandise were carefully protected from frost and damp. Grain might be stored under hay, fish salted or smoked, and vegetables packed in straw for insulation. Sellers relied on creativity as much as supply. One misjudged batch could be ruined overnight by frost or moisture. Merchants faced similar challenges. Transporting goods over snow-laden roads required sledges, pack animals, and careful timing. Rivers froze, bridges iced over, and long journeys became slow, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous. Traders often relied on inns or way stations, which offered warmth and a chance to rest, though at the cost of additional expense. Every frost-covered mile added both risk and value to goods reaching market. Town inns were essential hubs. Beyond shelter and warmth, they provided opportunities for social interaction, commerce, and information exchange. Travelers, merchants, and locals gathered, sharing news, strategies for surviving the cold, and, occasionally, the meager comforts of a shared meal. Fires were tended constantly, often by both staff and guests, as warmth was a collective effort and a scarce commodity. Food in towns was rationed carefully. Breads, salted meats, preserved vegetables, and cheese were common staples. Ale and wine served both as refreshment and a way to generate internal warmth. Tavern fires offered minor solace, but smoke, crowding, and poor ventilation meant that warmth was never entirely comfortable. Eating and drinking were often hurried, as exposure to cold was continuous and unavoidable. Clothing was crucial in the urban environment. Townspeople layered thick wool tunics, cloaks, hoods, gloves, and fur-lined boots. Tradespeople often wore leather aprons or additional coverings for both protection and warmth. Merchants, concerned with both comfort and appearance, balanced practicality with modest display of wealth. Cold hands and frozen feet were ubiquitous complaints, even for the relatively well-off. Winter trade also demanded ingenuity in storage. Cellars, warehouses, and stalls were insulated with straw, hay, or cloth. Merchants anticipated that ice, snow, and frost could ruin perishable goods. Animals sometimes provided additional warmth. Small stables adjacent to warehouses prevented extreme freezing, though odors, fleas, and moisture were side effects. Survival of goods was as much a part of commerce as selling them. Social interactions in winter were constrained by the cold. Crowds were smaller, streets quieter, and outdoor work slower. People relied more on enclosed spaces for socialization. Taverns, guild halls, and churches became vital meeting points. Community knowledge, such as which routes were safe, which inns were reliable, and which merchants had surplus goods, was crucial for survival and efficient trade. Guilds played a stabilizing role. Craftspeople, bakers, and weavers had to maintain production even during frost and snow. Guild rules dictated hours, quality standards, and sometimes collaborative sharing of fuel or workspace. Production slowed in the cold, but rarely stopped entirely. Guild members relied on each other for both labor and warmth, demonstrating that social cohesion was a form of practical survival. Children in towns contributed in small ways. Delivering goods, carrying messages, or assisting in family workshops provided warmth through activity and a sense of participation. Education, when available, often combined with labor, reflecting a winter rhythm that balanced survival and socialization. Play existed in brief bursts, usually outdoors in snow or ice, and was tempered by necessity and parental oversight. Religious life intersected with town life in winter. Churches offered warmth, gathering points, and spiritual comfort. Candlelit services, prayers for health and survival, and seasonal festivals punctuated the long months of frost. Clergy often provided guidance, rudimentary medical advice, and sometimes food for those in need. Religious and practical support were intertwined, reinforcing communal bonds. Even nobles engaged with towns during winter. Markets were sources of food, fuel, and luxury goods. Travel to and from estates was challenging but necessary for oversight, political obligations, and trade. Noble servants managed logistics, ensuring that supplies reached the household, fires were maintained, and winter routines continued. Wealth mitigated some discomfort, but not entirely. Even the grandest estates felt frost's persistent presence. Ultimately, winter life in towns combined endurance, ingenuity, and social interdependence. Merchants, artisans, and families adapted to frost, snow, and darkness through careful planning, layered clothing, communal effort, and creative solutions. Commerce continued, food was distributed, and society persisted, even when the streets were iced over and the winds bitter. As the frost glazed windows and blanketed streets, fires crackled in inns, homes, and workshops. Merchants wrapped goods, families layered clothing, and townspeople huddled in warm corners whenever possible. Survival in medieval towns during winter was a delicate choreography of labor, ingenuity, and social cooperation, carried out quietly, methodically, and with a persistent awareness of cold's unyielding presence. Next, we'll drift into the lives of medieval travelers and pilgrims who braved not just the countryside and towns, but the long, isolated roads of winter, how they coped, endured, and sometimes found fleeting beauty in frost-bitten landscapes. Chapter 13: Pilgrims and Winter Roads, Endurance, Frost, and Frozen Landscapes. Now, let's drift quietly along the long, cold roads that medieval pilgrims traversed during winter. Unlike townsfolk or rural families, pilgrims faced relentless exposure, miles of frost-covered paths, sparse shelter, and a landscape transformed into silence by snow and ice. Survival required endurance, preparation, and a steady acceptance of discomfort. Pilgrimages were motivated by faith, penance, or hope for divine favor. Popular destinations included Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, and Jerusalem, though smaller local shrines also attracted devoted travelers. Winter was considered especially trying but spiritually meritorious. Walking through cold and frost symbolized devotion and humility. Of course, the cold didn't pause for piety. Frostbitten toes, frozen hands, and snow-laden boots were universal companions. Travelers relied on simple layering to maintain warmth: woolen tunics, cloaks, hoods, and fur-lined boots. Gloves or mittens were often improvised from rags or scraps. Hats were essential. Head heat accounts for a large percentage of body warmth, and some pilgrims wrapped extra cloth around their faces to prevent frostbite. Even with preparation, exposure was constant, and every mile of frozen road tested resolve. Road conditions were brutal. Ice-covered ruts slowed wagons, pack animals struggled, and muddy sections beneath snow created hidden hazards. Rivers, often partially frozen, were dangerous to cross, while dense forests obscured safe paths. Pilgrims moved slowly, step by step, constantly alert for natural obstacles and occasional human threats: highwaymen, bandits, or unscrupulous guides. Shelter was scarce. Inns existed, but winter reduced availability. Pilgrims often relied on monasteries, churches, or even barns, huddling close to fires or animals. Sleeping arrangements were communal, cramped, and smoky. Heated stones, layered bedding, and animal warmth were the primary defenses against frost during the night. Travelers often slept fully clothed, boots included, to preserve as much body heat as possible. Food along the way was limited and monotonous. Hard bread, salted or smoked meat, dried fruits, and weak ale or water sustained the body. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes standing by a fire, before the cold forced movement once more. Nutrition was functional, not pleasurable. Malnourishment could accumulate over weeks of travel, weakening pilgrims against frost, illness, and exhaustion. The psychological demands of winter pilgrimage were significant. Long stretches of frozen, silent roads tested patience and morale. Pilgrims often walked in near silence, occasionally sharing conversation or prayer to stave off loneliness. Mental endurance was as crucial as physical stamina. Pilgrims developed rituals, repeating prayers, reciting psalms, counting steps, or observing natural phenomena as a way to maintain focus and preserve energy. Animal companions were both helpers and burdens. Horses carried heavy packs, while dogs provided warmth and protection. Yet animals required feeding, slowing travel, and increased exposure to cold and danger. Pilgrims balanced practicality with necessity, knowing that both human and animal endurance dictated the success of the journey. Seasonal challenges varied by region. In northern Europe, snow could block entire passes. In mountainous regions, blizzards and avalanches were real threats. Coastal routes faced icy winds and frozen docks. Pilgrims adapted by traveling in groups, timing journeys carefully, and learning local shortcuts or safer passages from experienced guides. Cooperation often made the difference between survival and disaster. Social aspects were surprisingly vital. Fellow pilgrims, travelers, and even locals provided information, temporary companionship, and minor comforts. Sharing fires, food, and shelter created networks of survival. While isolation was inevitable, human contact offered psychological warmth, guidance, and reassurance in a harsh landscape. Even modest acts offered relief. A friendly innkeeper, a shared loaf of bread, or a simple prayer exchanged with another traveler could transform a day of frost-bitten discomfort into a moment of quiet gratitude. Medieval pilgrims relied on these small, cumulative comforts to endure weeks of exposure. Nature itself offered fleeting beauty amid hardship. Frost-covered trees, sun glinting off snow, or the quiet of frozen fields created moments of wonder. Pilgrims noticed subtle changes in the landscape, tracks of animals in the snow, ice patterns on rivers, or distant lights of villages through the haze. These moments, though brief, punctuated the monotony and reinforced a connection to the world beyond personal struggle. Illness and injury were constant threats. Frostbite, respiratory infections, and exhaustion could end a journey. Pilgrims carried basic remedies, often herbal, and relied on local clergy for advice. The journey demanded vigilance, clothing adjustments, fire management, pacing, and careful observation of both personal health and environmental conditions. Despite hardships, winter pilgrimage had rewards beyond spiritual merit. Travelers developed resilience, resourcefulness, and patience. They learned to navigate frozen landscapes, endure discomfort, and rely on both themselves and their community. Journeys could last weeks or months, and completion was a triumph of both body and spirit. By the time pilgrims arrived at their destinations, shrines, churches, or sacred sites, they were transformed. Physical endurance, mental fortitude, and spiritual devotion were intertwined, shaped by frost, snow, and relentless winter roads. Success was measured less by luxury or comfort than by survival, perseverance, and the quiet satisfaction of having endured a season of hardship. Next, we'll drift into the specific tools and technologies that made winter life survivable, from heating implements to insulated clothing, stoves, and the ingenious household inventions of the medieval world. Chapter 14: Winter Tools and Technology, Fires, Clothing, and Household Ingenuity. Now, let's drift quietly into the practical side of medieval winter life. The tools, clothing, and household inventions that allowed people to endure frost, darkness, and snow. Survival was as much about clever adaptation as it was about resilience, and medieval people had an array of strategies to cope with the season. Fires were central. Almost every household, whether peasant hut, monastery, or castle, relied on them for warmth, cooking, and psychological comfort. Hearths were designed to maximize heat, often built centrally in homes so the warmth radiated to surrounding spaces. Firewood had to be chopped, stacked, and tended carefully. Smoke management was essential. Chimneys existed but were often rudimentary, meaning that people endured both warmth and persistent smoke inhalation. Heated stones were another innovation. Stones were placed in the fire until glowing, then wrapped in cloth and positioned in beds to radiate heat through the night. Families, particularly children, huddled near these stones, absorbing warmth that would otherwise have been lost to cold floors and drafts. The method was simple, low-tech, and surprisingly effective. Clothing was layered, dense, and utilitarian. Linen undergarments absorbed moisture and provided comfort. Wool tunics, cloaks, and hose retained heat. Fur and leather added insulation where needed most. Gloves, mittens, hats, and hoods were essential. Even the wealthiest layered carefully, because cold seeped through stone walls, wooden floors, and drafty windows. Clothing was both protection and a statement. Quality indicated status, while practicality ensured survival. Insulation in homes was minimal but inventive. Straw or rushes were spread on floors, walls were plastered with mud, and tapestries hung to block drafts. Peasants and nobles alike relied on textiles, animal hides, and layered bedding to create microclimates. Sleeping arrangements maximized warmth. Families often shared beds, huddled together for body heat, with animals sometimes joining to boost warmth further. Cooking implements and stoves evolved to address winter challenges. Pots and cauldrons were hung over fires, allowing slow cooking of pottage or stews. Clay or iron ovens, where available, retained heat and enabled more efficient meal preparation. Smoke, though ever present, was a byproduct that could also help preserve food and deter pests. Every culinary tool was a compromise between warmth, utility, and limited resources. Lighting technology mattered too. Candles, rushlights, and torches extended usable hours in darkness, though they were expensive or labor-intensive to produce. Wax candles were luxurious, while rushlights, made by dipping reeds in tallow, were common among peasants. Flickering lights served both practical and psychological functions, illuminating tasks while warding off the isolation of long winter nights. Water management was critical. Wells often froze, rivers slowed, and snow or ice needed to be melted. Households devised simple methods: insulated buckets, repeated heating over fires, or reliance on stored water in barrels. Access to liquid was essential for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, and the cold turned this routine necessity into a daily challenge. Tools for personal comfort included foot warmers, padded clothing, and insulated bedding. Furs, blankets, and straw-filled mattresses reduced exposure to cold floors. In some regions, wooden platforms elevated beds, creating small thermal advantages and reducing damp-related discomfort. Small touches, combined with constant vigilance, were the difference between tolerable winter nights and frost-bitten misery. Work tools were adapted for the cold. Iron implements were prone to frost and brittleness, so blacksmiths tempered them carefully. Farmers' plows, axes, and scythes were maintained to function in frozen ground or ice-choked fields. Carpenters, coopers, and other tradespeople designed winter-appropriate methods for constructing, repairing, or modifying objects in adverse conditions. Survival required continual attention to tools as much as to the body. Community knowledge augmented technology. Advice about layering, fire tending, food storage, and clothing construction passed through families, guilds, and monastic instruction. Techniques for preserving meat, insulating walls, or creating small heat-retaining devices were shared and refined. Knowledge was as valuable as material possessions. It reduced mortality and eased the psychological weight of winter. Even small innovations mattered. Spinning wheels allowed production of wool thread indoors, while looms created additional clothing or blankets. Simple devices for drying herbs, grains, or firewood helped extend food supplies. Heating plates, small braziers, and enclosed hearths were deployed strategically to maximize warmth in critical spaces. Every improvement, however minor, contributed to daily endurance. In some households, ingenuity extended to entertainment and comfort. Board games, storytelling props, or simple musical instruments provided mental warmth and distraction. Communities improvised, reusing materials creatively. Old furs became patchwork quilts, broken wooden implements became sleds, and leftover textiles served multiple purposes. Resourcefulness was essential, luxury was rare, but utility was everywhere. Even noble households embraced practical ingenuity. Heated tiles, tapestries, layered curtains, and servants maintaining fires were small but cumulative advantages. Technology wasn't simply about luxury, it was about survival, comfort, and sustaining the household through months of frost and darkness. In essence, medieval winter life depended on a careful combination of material tools, clothing, and human ingenuity. Fires, heated stones, insulation, layered garments, cooking implements, lighting, and communal knowledge all interacted to create microenvironments where survival was possible. Without these adaptations, frost, damp, and darkness would have made life unbearably harsh. As snow fell silently outside, hearths glowed, blankets were arranged, and families tended fires. Every small device, layer, or clever trick was part of a quiet, methodical system of survival. Winter was harsh, relentless, and unyielding, but human ingenuity, patience, and adaptation allowed life to persist in even the coldest months. Next, we'll drift into the emotional and cultural dimension of winter, the moods, artistic expression, and quiet moments of human creativity that flourish despite frost and darkness. Chapter 15. Winter Moods, Art, Music, and Quiet Creativity. Now, let's drift gently into the emotional and cultural side of medieval winter life, where frost, darkness, and long nights influenced art, music, and creativity. Even in cold, damp huts or drafty castles, people found ways to occupy the mind, soothe the spirit, and express themselves through subtle, quiet forms of creativity. Art was often functional but also expressive. Illuminated manuscripts, religious icons, and simple household decorations were created and appreciated during long winter nights. Monks, nuns, and literate nobles might spend hours copying texts, illustrating scenes, or painting borders, working by candlelight while the wind howled outside. Even a small mistake on parchment could ruin hours of meticulous labor, so patience and precision were virtues cultivated by frost and routine. Music provided warmth for the spirit. Harps, lutes, flutes, and simple percussion instruments accompanied prayers, storytelling, or social gatherings. Songs could be sacred or secular, slow and meditative or light and playful. The repetitive nature of some compositions mirrored the rhythm of winter labor, offering psychological comfort and a gentle structure to otherwise monotonous days. Even a single voice, singing softly by the hearth, could transform a frozen evening into something bearable. Storytelling thrived in winter. Families, communities, and monastic cells exchanged tales, legends, moral parables, historical accounts, and local anecdotes. Children learned patience, adults reflected on morals, and communities maintained collective memory. The quiet repetition of familiar stories created continuity, while the occasional introduction of a new tale injected variety and curiosity into long, dark months. Craftsmanship continued despite the cold. Woodworking, weaving, embroidery, and metalworking were practiced indoors, using residual warmth from fires and ingenuity in workspace organization. Small objects, such as combs, spoons, or decorative pieces, were made to serve practical and aesthetic purposes. Every creation was an exercise in patience, dexterity, and adaptation to winter conditions. Even mundane tasks carried a creative element. Preparing food, arranging firewood, or organizing storage required problem-solving and subtle innovation. How to best layer clothing for warmth, store vegetables to avoid rot, or hang herbs for drying became minor acts of ingenuity. Life itself was an ongoing interplay between necessity and creativity, sharpened by winter's constraints. Emotional reflection was also part of the season. Long nights encouraged introspection, contemplation of the past, and quiet planning for the future. People observed the changing landscape, considered their roles within family or community, and reflected on spiritual matters. Frosted fields, frozen rivers, and snow-laden forests became metaphors for endurance, resilience, and fleeting beauty amid hardship. Religious devotion intertwined with creative expression. Hymns, psalms, and prayers were composed, recited, or illustrated, combining artistry with spiritual reflection. Churches and monastic halls were decorated with seasonal greenery, candlelight, and simple embellishments. Even small gestures, arranging candles, hanging decorations, or illuminating manuscript borders, provided psychological warmth and satisfaction. Children's creativity flourished within constraints. They carved small wooden toys, made simple games, or enacted stories from folklore. Play was brief and practical, but imagination thrived despite. or perhaps because of limitations imposed by frost and scarcity. Learning and amusement were interwoven, cultivating both skill and patience. Winter also influenced community rituals and celebrations. Seasonal festivals, religious observances, and local customs incorporated music, visual symbols, and performance. Processions, singing, and symbolic gestures created shared experiences that alleviated monotony. Even in the coldest months, humans sought rhythm, beauty, and connection through communal acts of creativity. Art and music were not merely diversions, they shaped endurance. A carefully illustrated manuscript, a melodic chant, or a well-told story offered psychological relief, moral guidance, and cultural continuity. Creativity became a form of survival, sustaining morale when physical hardship and isolation threatened to dominate daily life. The environment itself inspired subtle aesthetic appreciation. Snow patterns, frozen rivers, icicles, and frost-encrusted foliage offered a form of visual meditation. Observing and describing these phenomena, even in words or simple sketches, allowed people to engage with their surroundings beyond mere survival. Winter became both a challenge and a quiet muse. Ultimately, medieval winter life was a balance between hardship and ingenuity, labor and reflection, survival and creativity. Fires, clothing, and food kept the body alive, but art, music, and storytelling nourished the mind and spirit. Even in darkness, people found rhythm, meaning, and beauty, demonstrating that endurance is as much psychological and cultural as it is physical. As snow drifted softly against wooden shutters, hearths glowed, and voices recited stories or sang low songs. Fingers traced patterns in parchment, strings vibrated gently on lutes, and eyes traced frost patterns outside. Winter imposed its quiet rhythm, but humans responded with layered warmth, subtle creativity, and gentle resilience, carrying life and culture through the coldest months. Next, we'll drift into the rituals and preparation for spring, the subtle transition from frost to thaw, and how medieval people planned, celebrated, and endured the final weeks of winter before the world began to bloom once more. Chapter 16. The Slow Thaw, Preparing for Spring and the End of Winter. Now, let's drift gently into the gradual transition from winter to spring, that subtle shift when frost begins to recede, daylight stretches a little longer, and the world hints at renewal. Medieval people paid close attention to these changes, preparing for planting, festivals, and the slow return to outdoor labor. The final weeks of winter were a delicate balance between endurance and anticipation, quiet work and cautious optimism. The first signs of thaw were subtle. Snow softened, ice cracked, and early buds appeared on trees, though much of the countryside remained muddy and cold. Villagers, monks, and nobles alike noted these changes carefully. Weather dictated the timing of sowing, animal husbandry, and maintenance tasks, and centuries of observation allowed communities to anticipate the gradual arrival of spring. Food preparation shifted with the season. Preserved stores, dried meat, salted fish, root vegetables, began to be supplemented with early greens, and stored grains were counted carefully to ensure they lasted until new crops were harvested. Peasants rotated provisions, prioritizing the oldest first. Bakers prepared bread with remaining stored flour, while households cleaned and repaired storage areas for new harvests. Even small adjustments in diet reflected both survival instincts and the subtle promise of spring. Animal care became a central concern. Livestock that had endured the harsh winter required assessment. Weak or ill animals were culled or sold, healthy ones were prepared for breeding and grazing. Shepherds and farmers inspected barns, reinforced shelters, and cleared mud-choked pathways. The slow thaw created new hazards, muddy fields, flooded pastures, but also opportunities to reclaim outdoor labor. Domestic labor intensified. Homes and workshops that had been quiet during the coldest months came alive with maintenance, repair, and preparation for planting. Floors were swept, roofs patched, and tools cleaned and sharpened. Clothing and bedding were mended, often in anticipation of lighter layers. Households worked methodically, transitioning from survival mode to readiness for the warmer months. Fires, while still essential, were managed differently. Days were longer, and the demand for constant heat lessened. Families shifted from stoking hearths constantly to maintaining moderate warmth. Cooking began to incorporate fresher ingredients as stores were rotated and early crops were harvested or purchased from nearby towns. Smoke remained part of life, but its intensity gradually diminished with longer daylight and less frost. Communities observed seasonal rituals and celebrations. Candlemas, Imbolc, and other festivals marked the slow approach of spring. Offerings, prayers, and minor feasts signaled hope, renewal, and continued survival. These rituals provided psychological markers, allowing people to measure time, reaffirm social bonds, and engage in collective reflection after months of isolation and endurance. Children began to spend more time outdoors. Play shifted from short bursts near hearths to longer activities in thawing fields. Simple games, sledding on remaining snow patches, and early agricultural chores combined amusement with responsibility. The slow return to movement reinforced physical health and social interaction, providing small reminders that the harshest months were waning. Merchants and townspeople resumed more regular trade. Frosted streets cleared enough to allow transport of goods, while markets became livelier as anticipation of spring goods increased. Seeds, early vegetables, and other seasonal supplies began to circulate. Inns and taverns adjusted their offerings to match shifting demand, providing warmth and sustenance while accommodating travelers returning from winter journeys. The natural world offered both challenges and subtle rewards. Muddy roads slowed movement, snowmelt flooded lowlands, and early rains made fields slippery. Yet, birds returned, rivers began to flow more freely, and animals emerged from winter dormancy. People observed these signs carefully, knowing that survival depended on timing labor, planting, and preparation accurately. Psychological adaptation continued. The slow thaw encouraged optimism, but not complacency. People remained cautious, balancing desire to work outdoors with residual risks from cold, illness, and unpredictable weather. Planning for spring required foresight, patience, and careful coordination across households, communities, and even religious institutions. Monasteries, castles, and noble estates initiated spring preparations with structured efficiency. Fields were surveyed, seeds prepared, and laborers assigned to specific tasks. Stockpiles were inventoried, repairs completed, and early planting scheduled according to weather patterns. Even small miscalculations could have significant consequences, so attention to detail was critical. As frost receded, social interaction increased. Villagers exchanged news, shared tools, and collaborated on communal tasks such as repairing bridges, clearing roads, and preparing for planting. Festivals and gatherings provided opportunities for both celebration and coordination, reinforcing community cohesion while easing the mental fatigue accumulated over long winter months. Finally, the slow thaw was also a period of reflection. People measured the winter's endurance, evaluated successes and losses, and mentally prepared for a new cycle of labor, growth, and survival. Survival was no longer just physical. It encompassed planning, anticipation, and the psychological transition from huddled endurance to active participation in a world gradually thawing and awakening. By the time the first full weeks of spring arrived, frost had largely receded, rivers flowed freely, and fields were ready for planting. Households, families, and communities had transitioned from survival to preparation, from reflection to action. Life continued, marked by the quiet rhythm of endurance, adaptation, and cautious optimism nurtured through months of cold, darkness, and frost. Next, we'll drift into the practices and small joys of early spring, gardening, animal care, and minor celebrations that welcomed longer days and the promise of warmer seasons. Chapter 17: Early Spring Life, Gardening, Livestock, and the First Warm Days. Now, let's drift gently into the earliest days of spring, when frost has mostly retreated, the soil softens, and life begins to stir quietly in fields, gardens, and pastures. For medieval people, early spring was a period of careful labor, subtle observation, and cautious celebration. It was the first breath of warmth after months of endurance, and it required a combination of patience, skill, and attentiveness. Gardening resumed with renewed focus. Early crops, onions, leeks, peas, and hardy greens, were planted in garden plots, sometimes covered with straw or cloches to protect against residual frost. Seedlings from winter storage were nurtured carefully, with attention to soil preparation, spacing, and drainage. Even minor miscalculations could compromise growth, so gardeners moved deliberately, balancing speed with precision. Fields underwent inspection and repair. Plows were sharpened, oxen or horses readied for work, and fences checked for damage from frost, snow, or wandering livestock. Communal labor was common. Neighbors assisted each other in preparing fields, repairing shared infrastructure, or rotating livestock. The thaw made land accessible again, but mud, lingering ice patches, and uneven terrain demanded careful navigation. Livestock care intensified. Animals that had survived winter were gradually reintroduced to pastures, though care was taken to avoid early spring hazards such as mud, standing water, and cold nights. Feeding routines adjusted as fresh grass became available, and breeding cycles were timed to maximize productivity later in the year. Attention to animal health remained critical. Even minor illnesses could set back months of preparation and labor. Water management became a priority. Meltwater had to be channeled effectively to prevent flooding, while wells and cisterns were inspected for contamination. Early irrigation for gardens and fields required careful planning, ensuring that water was available without creating swampy, disease-prone conditions. Simple tools, buckets, troughs, and ditches were used in clever ways to manage the transition from winter scarcity to spring abundance. Domestic labor continued alongside outdoor work. Homes were cleaned and repaired, bedding refreshed, and clothing adjusted for the warmer but still unpredictable temperatures. Families sorted through winter stores, disposing of spoiled food, and preparing spaces for spring crops. The rhythm of indoor and outdoor tasks created a gentle balance, allowing households to respond efficiently to seasonal change. Communal and religious life reflected the gradual thaw. Candlemas and early Marian feasts gave way to more outward-focused celebrations, with processions, communal meals, and rituals marking both the passing of winter and the arrival of spring. These gatherings reinforced social cohesion, provided psychological relief, and offered opportunities to share knowledge, labor, and resources. Children's routines expanded. Play extended into fields and yards, combining amusement with minor labor tasks such as fetching water, tending animals, or helping with early planting. The first warm days allowed longer periods outdoors, strengthening bodies, refining motor skills, and fostering social bonds. Education and training were integrated into practical activities, making work and learning nearly seamless. Trade and commerce adjusted to the new season. Markets became livelier as towns received early spring produce, seeds, and tools for planting. Merchants transported goods more efficiently over thawed roads, while inns accommodated travelers returning from winter journeys or religious pilgrimages. The circulation of goods reflected both economic necessity and the renewed pace of life outside the frozen months. Personal and spiritual reflection continued. Longer days encouraged observation of weather patterns, plant growth, and animal behavior, offering practical insights for farming, gardening, and survival. People also took mental stock of winter successes and failures, evaluating storage strategies, household management, and community collaboration. Reflection was practical, slow, and quietly meditative. Small joys punctuated labor. Early flowers, the return of birds, and the subtle fragrance of thawing earth provided sensory relief after months of frost and snow. Individuals noticed and appreciated these signs of renewal, using them as markers of time and mood. Even simple observations, a robin perched on a fence, water dripping from eaves, frost receding from windows, offered quiet satisfaction and gentle optimism. Art, music, and storytelling shifted subtly. Indoor activities continued, but longer daylight allowed outdoor gatherings, songs, and seasonal games. Children and adults alike participated in small rituals celebrating the first warmth, integrating creativity with labor. Even minor artistic expression, embroidery, drawing, or improvisation with natural materials, reflected a seasonal attentiveness, bridging survival and cultural enrichment. Finally, early spring was a time of cautious planning. Planting, grazing, household maintenance, and communal projects required foresight and coordination. Medieval people balanced the optimism of thaw with awareness of lingering hazards, frost, mud, illness, and unpredictable weather. The rhythm of early spring was deliberate, measured, and interwoven with lessons learned from winter endurance. By the time late March or early April arrived, landscapes were transformed. Fields were workable, gardens showed early growth, animals were active, and communities moved with renewed energy. The slow, quiet progression from winter to spring underscored resilience, patience, and the human capacity to adapt to seasonal rhythms with methodical effort and subtle appreciation for life's continuity. Next, we'll drift into the more social and communal aspects of spring, the ways towns, villages, and religious communities celebrated, collaborated, and prepared for the agricultural year ahead. Chapter 18: Spring Festivals, Communal Life, and Early Agricultural Work. Now, let's drift quietly into the social rhythms of early spring, where the first warmth of the season encouraged gatherings, celebrations, and collaborative labor. For medieval communities, spring marked the delicate intersection of survival, social cohesion, and preparation for the year ahead. It was a time when work and festivity blended, and subtle observation of both nature and neighbors guided daily life. Spring festivals were important markers of time and community. Candlemas and early Marian feasts gave way to festivities like the Feast of St. George, Lenten observances, and other local celebrations. These occasions combined ritual, social interaction, and practical coordination. People would attend church services, processions, and communal meals, signaling both gratitude for survival through winter and anticipation of productive months ahead. Towns and villages organized cooperative efforts during early spring. Communal labor, such as repairing roads, clearing irrigation ditches, or preparing shared grazing areas, was often scheduled around festivals, ensuring participation while reinforcing social bonds. Everyone had a role, and cooperation was not merely convenient but essential for survival. The thaw made land accessible, but it also revealed damage caused by winter storms, floods, or heavy snow, requiring coordinated repair. Agricultural preparation accelerated. Fields were plowed, fertilized, and sown with early crops. Labor was divided according to household capacity, social standing, and skill. Nobles oversaw larger estates, coordinating tenant labor and ensuring tools and animals were ready. Peasants focused on smaller plots, sometimes assisted by neighbors or family members. Precision and timing mattered. A miscalculated planting could compromise the harvest months later. Livestock management remained a daily focus. Pastures were cleared of debris left from winter storms, streams and ponds were checked for safety and cleanliness, and breeding schedules were carefully observed. Farmers monitored the health of animals closely, administering rudimentary remedies for injury or disease. Attention to detail in livestock care ensured productivity and reduced losses later in the season. Domestic routines adjusted to early spring. Homes were cleaned thoroughly after months of smoke, soot, and frost. Bedding was aired and repaired, clothing checked and mended, and kitchens prepared for the influx of fresh produce. Meal planning began to integrate early vegetables, eggs, and dairy, marking a subtle but significant shift from reliance on winter stores. Children participated actively in both labor and play. Tasks like watering gardens, gathering firewood, or helping with early planting offered both education and practical contribution. Play expanded outdoors, taking advantage of longer daylight, and often incorporated seasonal rituals or minor games that taught rhythm, coordination, and social cooperation. Childhood and labor were intertwined seamlessly in early spring routines. Trade and markets responded to seasonal change. Seeds, early vegetables, and basic tools circulated more freely as roads thawed and rivers flowed again. Merchants timed deliveries to coincide with planting schedules, providing towns and villages with essential supplies. Inns and taverns adjusted offerings to match changing demand, sometimes hosting traveling laborers or pilgrims who arrived with the first warmth of spring. Religious life continued to structure communal activity. Lent and early feast days offered both spiritual reflection and practical organization of labor. Church announcements, prayers for healthy crops, and blessings for livestock reinforced moral, social, and agricultural priorities. Communities relied on clergy to coordinate information, provide guidance, and mediate disputes arising from resource allocation or labor responsibilities. Small-scale crafts and household production resumed vigor. Weaving, spinning, carpentry, and tool maintenance continued alongside agricultural work. Artisans repaired or produced implements needed for planting, cleaning, and domestic life. Creativity and utility remained intertwined, reflecting the ongoing need to balance survival, productivity, and aesthetic or spiritual expression. Observation of natural rhythms guided action. Farmers and gardeners monitored early bloom, bird activity, soil moisture, and weather patterns. Subtle cues dictated timing for sowing, pruning, or tending livestock. Knowledge accumulated over years or even generations informed decisions, demonstrating the quiet sophistication of medieval environmental awareness. Even leisure was structured around labor and observation. Simple games, storytelling, music, and minor festivities provided psychological relief, reinforced communal bonds, and allowed subtle reflection on seasonal cycles. Artistic and social activities were integrated into daily life, blending endurance, observation, and subtle joy in ways that were unobtrusive yet essential for morale. By the end of early spring, communities were moving steadily from survival mode toward productivity. Fields were sown, animals were active and healthy, households were organized, and festivals punctuated labor with social and spiritual reinforcement. The rhythm of life reflected balance between work and celebration, observation and action, survival and subtle enjoyment. The transition from winter to spring emphasized the medieval capacity for patience, ingenuity, and social coordination. Months of endurance gave way to measured activity as communities navigated the interplay of weather, labor, and social expectation. Life moved with a gentle, persistent rhythm, quietly harmonized with the cycles of the natural world. Next, we'll drift into the ways spring labor evolved into early summer routines, the rhythm of planting, tending livestock, and gradually longer days shaping both work and social life. Chapter 19. From spring to early summer, planting, tending, and extended days. Now, let's drift gently into the transition from spring to early summer, when days lengthen, temperatures rise, and the rhythms of medieval life shift from cautious preparation to active cultivation and sustained labor. This period was defined by careful timing, communal coordination, and a delicate balance between endurance and anticipation of the year's harvests. Fields became the central focus of daily activity. Early crops planted in spring now required tending, weeding, soil aeration, and monitoring for pests. Tools like hoes, rakes, and simple wooden implements were used methodically, often in shared labor groups or under the guidance of more experienced farmers. Mistakes could have lasting consequences, so work was deliberate, steady, and rhythmically paced. Irrigation and water management became increasingly important. Meltwater and early rains needed to be channeled to prevent flooding, while ensuring soil moisture was sufficient for growing plants. Channels, ditches, and simple wooden troughs were maintained carefully, reflecting accumulated knowledge of terrain and water flow. Even modest adjustments could determine whether crops thrived or struggled. Livestock routines intensified. Animals grazed longer hours as pastures improved, while shepherds and herders monitored health, feeding, and breeding cycles. Milk, wool, and other resources became more abundant, but so did labor requirements. Fences had to be checked, water sources maintained, and predators monitored. Medieval people developed a subtle, ongoing dialogue with their animals, understanding patterns, moods, and productivity. Domestic tasks adjusted to longer daylight. Homes were cleaned, clothing repaired, and bedding refreshed. Kitchens shifted from winter stew to incorporate more fresh vegetables, eggs, and dairy products. Preservation continued. Some food was salted, dried, or stored, but reliance on winter stores diminished. Families balanced labor-intensive outdoor work with necessary indoor routines. Children became active participants in extended daily cycles. They helped with planting, weeding, and animal care, integrating learning, play, and practical contribution. Longer days allowed extended periods of activity, and outdoor play often doubled as minor training in agricultural skills. Responsibility and recreation were seamlessly integrated, reinforcing both physical endurance and social cohesion. Communal life continued to revolve around labor, but festivals and social gatherings punctuated work. Religious observances, saints' days, and local feasts offered opportunities for rest, reflection, and cooperation. Labor and celebration were intertwined, sustaining morale and reinforcing networks essential for collective survival and productivity. Trade and commerce followed seasonal rhythms. Markets received early summer produce, seeds for successive crops, and tools necessary for planting and tending. Merchants traveled more reliably on thawed roads, while rivers facilitated transport of heavier goods. Inns and taverns accommodated travelers, laborers, and traders, blending practical services with social and economic interaction. Crafts and artisanal work were integrated with agricultural labor. Blacksmiths repaired plows, carpenters mended barns, and weavers produced cloth for warmer months. Every craft was tied to utility and survival, yet creativity persisted subtly. Decorative touches, intricate weaving patterns, or small innovations in tool design demonstrated both skill and aesthetic awareness. Observation of nature became increasingly critical. Farmers and gardeners monitored rainfall, soil condition, plant growth, and animal behavior. Birds, insects, and subtle shifts in weather offered cues for timing labor. Humoral beliefs and folk knowledge guided action alongside practical experience, creating a layered understanding of environment and risk. Health and endurance remained ongoing concerns. Longer workdays and physical labor increased fatigue, while exposure to early summer weather, sun, rain, and insects required attentiveness. People paced themselves, rested strategically, and maintained modest personal care routines. Survival and productivity were deeply intertwined with observation and self-regulation. Even leisure adapted to season. Music, storytelling, and minor games shifted outdoors, often coinciding with brief pauses in labor. Singing while working, recounting tales during meal breaks, or engaging in playful competitions offered both psychological relief and subtle reinforcement of communal bonds. Entertainment and work blended quietly, shaping mood and maintaining cohesion. By early summer, the landscape was fully awake. Fields were green and growing, animals were active, and communities moved with extended daylight. Life had transitioned from winter endurance to active cultivation, integrating labor, observation, and subtle celebration. The rhythm was deliberate, sustained, and interwoven with natural cycles, reflecting centuries of adaptation to seasonal constraints and opportunities. Next, we'll drift into the height of early summer, the peak of planting, tending, and the social dynamics that emerged as communities worked in close rhythm with one another and the natural world.